Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Zoe Resnick-Gawanter, Director of Public Programs here at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the historic B'nai Israel Sanctuary on the Jewish Museum of Maryland Herbert Bierman campus, and to the launch of the new Core Connections series, with tonight's program featuring a lecture with Dr. Eric L. Goldstein. The recent opening of Jews of Maryland at the Crossroads of Identity is a landmark moment in the museum's history. Our first core exhibition that provides a statewide historical survey of the Jewish experience in Maryland. This evening's launch of the Core Connections program series marks a deeper exploration of the themes raised within the exhibition. Tonight, we have the privilege of having Dr. Goldstein share his deep knowledge about Maryland's Jewish history, followed by an audience Q&A and exploration of the exhibit itself. Drawing on the award-winning text that served as a key source for the development of Crossroads, Dr. Goldstein's remarks will draw from On Middle Ground, A History of Baltimore Jews. The book was co-authored with Deborah Weiner and published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2018. Through tonight's presentation, we'll have the opportunity to learn more about the historical factors that have given Jewish Baltimore a unique character and feel, but also allowed it to contribute in outsized ways to American Jewish life over the past 250 years. There are a few recognitions and announcements I have to share before we begin our program. First, a warm welcome to the Emory alumni community for joining us this evening. I want to extend gratitude to Emory Hillel, to the Emory Alumni Association, and to JMM board leadership for your vision and partnership in gathering the Emory community in connection to this moment for the museum. Thank you. This evening's program is made possible in part thanks to JMM members. You can learn about how to support the museum's work by becoming a member on the museum's website, where you can also find more information about upcoming Core Connections events, including our next installment, the opening celebration of Re-Intimacy Image Identity, coming up on Sunday, June 28th from 4 to 6 p.m. Visit www.jewishmuseummd.org to learn more about membership, upcoming programs, and all things JMM. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Goldstein. Eric O. Goldstein is an associate professor of history and Jewish studies at Emory University, where he directed the Tom Institute for Jewish Studies for over a decade. In addition to On Middle Ground, he is also the author of The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity, published by Princeton in 2006. From 2007 to 2012, he was the editor of the quarterly scholarly journal, American Jewish History, and he currently serves as the president of the Southern Jewish Historical Society. Dr. Goldstein served as an academic advisor to the development of Jews at the Crossroads, Maryland Jews at the Crossroads of Identity, and it is a pleasure to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Goldstein.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, well, let's see. Well, it's a pleasure to be here for many reasons. First of all, I'm thrilled to be part of the Emory alumni contingent. I myself am an Emory alum, in addition to having taught there for 25 years. So it's a thrill to be part of that group. And also, as I was explaining to some of those folks earlier, this is kind of a collision of worlds for me because I have a long association with the Jewish Museum of Maryland as well. I grew up in Annapolis, but I have strong Baltimore roots. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in Baltimore, 2 of them in East Baltimore in the Patterson Park area, and another grandfather who grew up in Louisiana, but his mother was from Baltimore, and he was born here on Hanover Street in the early part of the 20th century. So aside from being interested in the Jews of Maryland more broadly, and I've just FYI, this morning I sort of tried to combine speaking engagements. This morning I was in Annapolis celebrating with the congregation there, Knesset Israel, on their 120th anniversary. And because I've done research of the history of Jews in Annapolis, I gave a talk there this morning. So this is kind of a double header for me. So it's kind of nice because it's combining my two interests, the two parts of my identity, the Annapolis, and now I get to talk about the Baltimore roots. And in fact, the book On Middle Ground was dedicated to my 3 Baltimore grandparents. Because I was interested in Jewish history growing up, I was always seeking out connections and places where I could work and do research. And when I went to Emory in 1988, I remember I drew up a little resume and I sent it to the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I wanted to know if they had any internships or summer jobs available. And to my great delight, I got a letter in the mail. This is before email was a thing. That they had a position for a curatorial assistant, and I worked that first summer of my college career here as a curatorial assistant. And then they invited me back, and I worked on several exhibitions under 2 different curators. And then I eventually went to graduate school and studied Jewish history on the graduate level and earned a PhD, and I somehow transitioned to writing essays for the museum. When they would have an exhibit and they'd publish a catalog, they had asked me to contribute an essay. So over the years, through my association with the museum, I came to write, several pieces. I wrote a piece about Henrietta Zold when they had an exhibit about her here. I wrote one of the essays in the Voices of Lombard Street exhibit about this neighborhood and what Jewish neighborhoods look like in Baltimore in the period before the massive East European migration, when there weren't thickly populated Jewish neighborhoods, but Jews did have a distinctive residential pattern. When there was an exhibit here on Jews in the small towns of Maryland, I wrote an essay about that topic. So after writing so many pieces, I just made an offhand comment to a friend of mine, Deb Weiner, who was the historian in residence here for many years. I've written so many pieces, and I knew she had written so many pieces, similar pieces. I said, we have a book here, we should put this all together. And the director of the museum at that time jumped on the opportunity, and several years later, the result was this book, On Middle Ground, which is a history of the Jews of Baltimore. So anyway, just to say that I have a long path of development where I have, had these attachments to the museum, which led to this book, and it's just a thrill to be back here to talk about it, and also the Emory piece is a nice connection as well. When we wrote this book, one of the things that we really thought about is, how is this history of Jewish Baltimore going to be different? Like, what's different about Baltimore? So I want to start with a little story that I always tell about this. When I was little, my father told me this story from the news, which always stuck with me. I guess it was later because I was only 1 year old in 1971, but I looked it up. That's apparently when this happened. In 1971, Philadelphia's notorious mayor, Frank Rizzo, found himself embroiled in a controversy after appointing his own brother, Joe, to serve as the city's fire commissioner. According to one account, the mayor, when pressed by journalists about the appointment, shot back to his questioners, "Who should I have hired, your brother?" And I always think that's funny because as a historian, I often am interested in writing about the things that are related to me, that are my family, that are the town that my family came from. So choosing to write about a particular city or town is kind of similar to the process Mayor Rizzo must have experienced in choosing a fire commissioner. Despite the array of worthy candidates out there, one's heart tends to pull you to the one you know and love the best. But just as Rizzo's choice did not pass the smell test, historians of urban life need a better reason than "that's where I come from" to choose a subject for scholarly research. So as I embarked on this project with my friend Deb Weiner, again, she was the research historian in residence here at the museum, on this journey to write this first comprehensive scholarly history of Baltimore Jewry, we struggled with this question, like what is it about? Why write this book? You know, we're from here. We have connections here. Deb worked here. My family was from here, but that's not enough of a reason to write a book. You know, the book has to have some focus, some argument, something unique that justifies it as an independent study. So why, the question we were struggling with is, why did Jewish Baltimore matter? So to answer this question, we thought a lot about the ways in which Baltimore has been unique and different from other major Jewish centers. What we came to see is that Baltimore in many ways confounds the categories that we often use to classify and characterize American cities. For example, although its importance as a port city and a manufacturing center put it in league with northern industrial centers such as Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, its social and political climate was influenced by its ties to the South and the legacy of slavery and segregation, which is different than those cities. Long established as a major American city, Baltimore's slower pace and southern orientation allowed it to retain what journalist Gil Sandler describes as a distinct small town feel. This sense of inhabiting a kind of middle ground between the ethnic urban north and the more rural, less diverse region to the south was captured beautifully by a colleague of mine in the field of immigration history, a very distinguished professor, Alan Kraut, of American University in DC. And he wrote a piece about in a forum about ports of entry, immigration ports of entry other than New York, of which Baltimore was an important one. He wrote an essay and he talked about his first introduction to ethnic life in Baltimore when he first moved to this area to become a professor in DC. He visited Baltimore for the first time in 1975 to attend an Orioles game at the old Memorial Stadium. And he encountered a medley of conflicting images. Entering the stands, a vendor approached him with the cry of, "Hey bud, want a bow?" Referring, of course, to National Bohemian Beer, which Kraut soon learned tasted great with the kosher hot dogs sold in the park. The man sitting next to him explained that Baltimore had once had many breweries, with beers reflecting the different nationalities of those who brewed and drank them. The same fan scoffed at his hot dog, telling him he would have done better to pick up a corned beef sandwich on Lombard Street in the city, in the heart of the city's old Jewish quarter, which is where we are right now. At the very least, suggested the man, he should stop for dinner at Little Italy on his way out of town. At this point, Kraut had a pretty good idea that Baltimore had a rich ethnic life along the lines of other industrial cities like Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Chicago. The only event that left me somewhat puzzled, Kraut recalled, occurred during the seventh inning stretch when local fans, the descendants of Germans, Bohemians, Irish, Italians, and East European Jews, all rose to their feet to bellow out a chorus of, "Thank God I'm a country boy." Had Kraut studied the city further, he would have found that occupying the middle ground has been one of Baltimore's most unique features, one that has shaped its distinct cultural, economic, and social patterns. To better introduce you to this idea of a middle ground, and that's the name of our book is On Middle Ground, and to explain some of the ways it has made Baltimore Jewry a distinct and nationally important community, I want to take you through 4 themes that we examined in our book. So first and foremost, and also because the exhibition that you'll have a chance to view after the talk is in some ways based on some of the themes of this book. So you'll see some of these things in the way that the Crossroads exhibit is organized. And you'll see that there's an entire section there on the importance of geography. So that's really, I think, kind of, if I had to sum up the central part of the argument of the book, it's that geography really matters, that because Baltimore was located where it was, it produced a much different type of Jewish life than other major Jewish centers in the United States. So first and foremost, we found that geography really matters, and that Baltimore's unique setting, especially between North and South, has provided particular opportunities for advancement, that have made it a magnet for Jewish settlers because that was related to certain economic trends. And that was also what helped transform the city into a major hub of Jewish life. Benefiting from a growing overseas trade and unparalleled transportation routes to the west, Baltimore quickly became a major destination for Jews after the 1824 completion of the National Road. The National Road was a major transportation lane, a road that stretched from the East Coast to the west through, for example, if you can envision a map of Maryland, through Hagerstown, Cumberland, into the Ohio region and further west. So Baltimore was the starting point of this major transportation and trade route that helped open up the western part of the United States. So from the very early period, Baltimore was a great place that was connected to the interior of the country and facilitated trade and commerce. The newcomers were part of a much larger, the Jews who came to Baltimore in the years after 1824 were part of a much larger wave of German and Irish immigrants who poured into the city from the 1820s to the 1850s to participate in the booming economy, which rested in large part on the city's connections to budding Western communities such as Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis. And also Baltimore had excellent connections to southern port cities such as Wilmington, North Carolina. So Baltimore was also a kind of a gateway to the south. So its location where it was made it both a gateway to the western part of the country that was developing, but also it was kind of a link between north and south, and it was really the largest city. It was the southernmost city of its size. Southern cities below it were generally not as big as Baltimore, so it was a major trade hub in multiple directions. Jews in Baltimore developed important trading ties with relatives, countrymen, and co-religionists in all of these locations. So you could send goods to your relative or the person from the same Germantown who had some kind of an operation in St. Louis or Cincinnati, and they could get the goods that maybe came here and were taken off of a ship and then placed on a wagon traveling the National Road. So it became a hub of a Jewish ethnic economy that mirrored the larger economic networks emanating from the city. Though Baltimore's position as a national center slipped somewhat following the Civil War, the Jewish population benefited from the city's position as a gateway between the industrial north and the growing retail market of the postbellum South. By the 1890s, with the huge expansion of the ready-to-wear clothing industry, before the Civil War, most clothing was made by hand, and many Jews were in what we call the dry goods business, which is, it's always kind of a mystery what exactly that means when, it sounds natural to say, my grandfather was in the dry goods business, but what that really is things related to clothing that aren't clothing. So like lace and material and all the buttons and things like that. That was a common Jewish profession. And many Jews were in the business of selling secondhand clothing, but ready-to-wear clothing or ready-made clothing was not a big industry until after the Civil War because there was a leap in technology due to the need to manufacture many uniforms in a quick way. The technology for making ready-made clothes was accelerated during the Civil War, and then I guess lots of merchants, but Jews were particularly prominent in the clothing industry that then turned that into a big industry for all types of clothing after the Civil War. So Baltimore was a real hub for the clothing industry, and many German Jewish merchants who maybe had been dry goods merchants or maybe had originally been peddlers became clothing manufacturers in Baltimore, and it was one of the cities that was a center of that industry beginning in the post-Civil War period. Baltimore was home to major German Jewish clothing manufacturers, leading Jewish-owned retail emporiums, and one of the country's largest wholesalers. And this is a firm that came along a bit later and was founded by an East European Jewish merchant. He was actually from Lithuania, came here in the 1880s, Jacob Epstein, who founded a really fabulous business, which was extremely well known, not only in Baltimore, but all through the South, called the Baltimore Bargain House. The Baltimore Bargain House was, again, a wholesale company, and Epstein would essentially supply not just Jewish, but in many cases Jewish store owners throughout the entire South. They would get their goods from the Baltimore Bargain House, and he also would give goods to peddlers who would start in Baltimore and who would travel throughout the South. So it really exemplifies the way that Baltimore was a kind of hub that served a much larger region, and that is one of the things that drew a lot of Jewish people here to be in the clothing industry and in the retail clothing industry, as well as in manufacturing, because it was an important center for that trade for a good part of the country. Meanwhile, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's partnership, the railroad came along shortly after the National Road, and it cemented this tie of Baltimore and its contacts to the western part of the United States. But after the Civil War, the B&O Railroad established a partnership with the North German Lloyd shipping line, which was a major shipping line that operated mostly between Bremen, Germany, and Baltimore. And they cemented their ties to the B&O Railroad by creating a partnership that cemented Baltimore's role as the nation's second largest immigrant port of entry, bringing the city a fresh influx of newcomers and linking it economically with the destinations of those who settled elsewhere. So the way it worked is that you could buy a ticket. If you were a European immigrant and coming to the United States, you could buy a ticket on a steamship from Bremen to Baltimore, and then you could, with the same ticket, you could then just transfer and get on a B&O train and go anywhere on the B&O network. And so that caused a lot of immigrants to travel from Bremen so they could get onto the B&O Railroad. But it also, by creating this kind of connection to Baltimore, it also just caused a lot of immigrants who just chose Bremen as a point of departure as opposed to going to Hamburg or Liverpool, and then they were brought to Baltimore. So it brought, probably millions of immigrants over time through the city of Baltimore, and of course many of them did stay here. Along with these economic ties to points west and south, Baltimore became a place that Jews spread everywhere from the Ohio River Valley to the Carolinas turned for kosher supplies and religious functionaries. So it was a business hub, but it was also a kind of a Jewish cultural hub for all, because there was this overlay of business life and religious and cultural life, right? If Jacob Epstein was supplying all of those peddlers and they were coming to Baltimore for their goods, they were also at the same time looking to Baltimore as a kind of anchor, a place where they could get religious services, where they could look to as a center in their religious and cultural life as well. And I want to particularly direct you to an item when you come in the exhibit on the left side. In a case, there's a book that has Hebrew handwritten script. That is a circumcision registry book, which was carried by a mohel, a ritual circumciser named Marcus Pollock. He was a German Jew who lived in Baltimore beginning around the 1830s, and for about 30 years, he was an itinerant peddler and mohel, and he went out of Baltimore, and according to his book, which is a great source for social history, he circumcised young Jewish boys between 1830s and the Civil War, 1860s. I think it goes up to 1862, in the entire region from southern Pennsylvania into West Virginia and as far south as North Carolina, right? And so that was an entire huge region where there weren't, at that time, a lot of communities with synagogues. There weren't a lot of communities where there was a person who could perform a Brit Milah. And so they had to wait until this itinerant mohel from Baltimore came to them. And also while he was doing it, he was selling goods or whatever, because you probably didn't make such a great living just being a mohel. But what it does is it's kind of provides a map of this region of Baltimore's influence, right? So you have this city of Baltimore, this great Jewish center, and that is kind of its entire region of influence, right? Like up into Pennsylvania, but in areas where maybe Baltimore was a little closer than Philadelphia. And then, to the west, because you go up to the Appalachian Mountains, and it was probably easier to access from Baltimore than somewhere on the other side of the mountains. And then all the way down as far as North Carolina. So it just gives you a sense, right, of these networks that these peddlers and these merchants created, and that Baltimore was at the center of this immense set of networks that were both business networks, but they were also religious and cultural networks. Single men returned to Baltimore from these locations to marry. Synagogues in these regions took the name of Baltimore congregations to whom they looked for support and guidance. So, for example, in North Carolina, which was particularly attached to Baltimore, there were a lot of people who settled in North Carolina who came out of Baltimore. There are like multiple congregations called Oheb Shalom in North Carolina, because the people who founded them had originally been members of Oheb Shalom in Baltimore in the 1850s and 60s. Even after the great waves of immigration ended and Baltimore's importance as a manufacturing and transportation center faded, the city's central location on the eastern seaboard, its proximity to other major centers, and its comparatively low cost of living all continued to attract Jewish newcomers and make it a hub for Jews spread over a vast region. Even today, just as an example, and this will interest the Emory folks, the thriving Orthodox community of Atlanta, Georgia, is kind of like a satellite community of Baltimore, with two leading rabbis born of Baltimore families, and a yeshiva and kollel, and I live right in this neighborhood, populated mainly with graduates of Ner Yisroel yeshiva here in Baltimore, with names like Neuberger and Feldman abounding. So even today, you see these connections where Baltimore is like a feeder community and an anchor for people who are in less populated areas that don't have the same Jewish cultural and religious amenities. So this kind of brings me into the second theme, which goes beyond just the physical geography and how it shaped business and economic opportunities, to talk a little bit more about how it shaped how did geography really shape Jewish life? And one of the things is that Baltimore's position as a bridge between regions made the city a gathering place of impressive Jewish leaders. Many Jewish leaders and luminaries either lived in Baltimore at one time or spent significant time here, and so they transformed the city into a place that had an exceptional level of activity in different Jewish movements, where different ideas and denominations were crystallized, and it led Baltimore just as the title of the exhibit suggests, as this crossroads where these people gathered and passed through and spent time, led Baltimore to have a kind of outsized influence in the history particularly of American Judaism, but later also with movements like Zionism, where Baltimore played a particular role, especially for a city of its size, which was smaller than some other northern urban centers. So just to give you some examples, Baltimore, interestingly, was the home to America's first ordained rabbi, Abraham Rice, who arrived at the Baltimore Hebrew congregation in 1840. Many people are surprised to learn that there was no ordained rabbi in the United States before 1840 who permanently lived and worked here. And it was, but at the same time, so we had the first ordained rabbi who was Orthodox at Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, which was originally an Orthodox congregation. And Baltimore is also the home to the country's first successful Reform temple, Har Sinai, which was founded in 1842. And I say successful because there was a kind of aborted attempt to create something called the Reform Society of Israelites in Charleston in 1824, but it lasted only a short time. But Har Sinai was the first truly kind of permanent or ongoing Reform congregation founded in the United States in 1842. So, you have these two kind of momentous firsts in Baltimore, where you would maybe expect it to be in New York or Philadelphia that those things happened. And then another kind of piece of that is that Benjamin Zold, you might have heard of Henrietta Zold, who I'll talk about in a minute, but her father was a rabbi, a Hungarian Jewish rabbi named Benjamin Zold, who came here in 1859 to serve the Oheb Shalom congregation that I mentioned earlier. And Benjamin Zold was a key ideological precursor of the conservative movement in Judaism. So, here we have like the beginnings of the three largest Jewish denominations in the United States, all kind of beginning to some extent in Baltimore. And notably, Rabbi Zold and Har Sinai's firebrand rabbi David Einhorn engaged in a series of polemics about reform. They were on very different ends of the ideological spectrum, and they would go back and forth with articles and pamphlets, kind of attacking one another, but also sketching out their vision for the future of American Judaism and the reform of Judaism. And that exchange of articles helped define the contours of American Judaism as it crystallized during the late 19th century. So that's a really important thing to have happened in Baltimore. From the 1880s through the middle of the 20th century, Baltimore's role as a pace-setting Jewish community was signified by its leadership in the American Zionist movement. In fact, local Jews, East European Jewish immigrants, founded the nation's first Zionist organization in 1889. And then in 1897, Baltimore was the only city or community in the entire United States to send an official delegate to the first World Zionist Conference held in Basel, Switzerland, organized by Theodor Herzl in 1897. I believe there was one other American delegate, but I think that Rabbi Shepsel Schaefer of the Shereth Israel congregation here in Baltimore was the only one who was designated to represent a specific community. And amidst the ferment of Baltimore's Zionist scene, Rabbi Zold's daughter Henrietta developed her passionate belief in the importance of Jewish settlement in Palestine. Years before, she founded Hadassah and became one of Israel's most important pre-state leaders. Henrietta Zold was disenchanted with the style of Judaism in her father's congregation. He had no sons, and he raised Henrietta, who was his eldest daughter, in the way that a rabbi would have traditionally raised an eldest son, and taught her how to read sacred texts and rabbinic works. And she was, really a fabulous Jewish scholar. I don't know if you know much about Henrietta Zold's life, but one of the important things to know is that she had all of the knowledge and qualifications of a rabbi, and when the Jewish Theological Seminary, when Solomon Schechter became the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, Henrietta Zold approached him and asked if she could become a student there. And he said yes, under the condition that she, at the completion of her course, that she not, quote, seek rabbinical honors, meaning she was allowed to go through the classes and the same training that the men who were becoming rabbis were going through, but she would not be allowed to call herself a rabbi at the end of the course because at that time there were no women rabbis. So it just gives you a taste of what her background was, but because of her passion for Judaism, She found the Jews in her father's congregation, which was kind of what we call like a moderate reform congregation. As I said, it was kind of a precursor. The congregation itself was what became a reform congregation, but Rabbi Zold himself was a little bit more traditional than his congregation, and Henrietta Zold particularly had a disdain for the members of the congregation, and so she was attracted to the new Eastern European immigrants that were coming into Baltimore at that time. And she started a night school for them to teach them English. And after the school was done, she would sit around and talk to them, and they would talk about Zionism. And she became kind of a convert to Zionism through their interest. And she said that the Jews in her father's congregation had the souls of bookkeepers, but these Jews had the souls of Jews. It was an interesting, and that was a kind of an interaction between a prominent member of the German Jewish community and these young immigrants that might not have happened in a larger center like New York, where these communities were more divided from one another. So it's part of the story of Zionism in Baltimore. Another noteworthy thing is that in 1947, Baltimore's port became directly involved in the struggle for a Jewish state, as local Zionists secretly acquired and outfitted a Chesapeake Bay steamship that unfurled its new name as it approached Palestinian waters. Does anybody know what it is? Exodus 1947, right. Its failed mission to settle Holocaust survivors in Palestine became a public relations coup and one of the foundational stories of Israel. In recent years, Baltimore's position as a relatively nearby and much more affordable alternative to New York City, combined with the existence of the previously mentioned and nationally respected Ner Israel or Ner Yisrael yeshiva, has given it another measure of distinction. Baltimore has the highest percentage of Orthodox adherents of any Jewish community in the nation. And the other thing I want to say is that on the one hand, because of geography, and again, we're still kind of focusing on the importance of place and geography, and that all of this has to do with Baltimore being located where it is. In some ways, it made it kind of this hothouse for different viewpoints and innovation and so on. But in some ways, its geography, and because it was also, for example, it was Southern, and Southern culture was more conservative, that was tied in with race relations, which we'll talk about in a minute. But Baltimore, because of its geographical location, was a more conservative climate. And you definitely see that in the way that Jewish movements were created in Baltimore. So one way of looking at it is that located at the meeting of regions between North and South, being in a place at the kind of meeting point of urban and rural, native and foreign. It was a port of immigration, black and white, that it was a place where people took middle, again, here's the idea of middle, that it was a place where people learned how to compromise and navigate contrary viewpoints. But to some extent, it was part of a more conservative cultural climate. So just as an example, while among Jewish immigrant communities in New York and Philadelphia, radicalism was very common there. In New York, the Jewish part of New York elected Meyer London, a socialist candidate, to represent them in Congress. But in Baltimore, radical movements like socialism and anarchism were much less welcome because it was a more conservative climate. They viewed radical movements with great disdain because they were policing the color line, and they were afraid of anything that could lead to some type of political rebellion or labor unrest or something like that. So in Baltimore, although there were some Jewish socialists, and there was a workman's circle which was very active, but it was much less socialist identified than it was in New York or Philadelphia. And Jews in Baltimore tended to mostly express their political activism through membership mostly in the Democratic Party, but also sometimes in the Republican Party. And immigrant Jews, the way that they would have been active in socialist movements in New York, here it expressed itself much more through party politics. And there were many Jewish aldermen. There were East European Jewish immigrants who were elected to the state government in Annapolis and even to the U.S. House of Representatives. And Baltimore was a place where where it was still quite early at the turn of the 20th century for there to be a Jewish senator, and Baltimore had a Jewish senator, Isidore Rayner, who represented Maryland in the U.S. Senate at the turn of the century. Just to point out some more similar examples, during the Civil War, the Jewish community of Baltimore was in a city that was, on the one hand, had Southern sympathies, but it was occupied for most of the war by Union troops. And so Baltimore Jews, also because of their business interest and because they knew that sectional conflict and secession from the Union would be disastrous to their trade, they generally supported a kind of policy of conciliation between the regions. Okay, the third of the four themes is that there were a series of new beginnings for Baltimore that were made possible by its unique geography and economic advantages that often allowed Jews to become insiders despite forces working to make them outsiders. According to the conventional wisdom of American Jewish history, Jews were at a social disadvantage in locations where they had not been among the founding generation. In Boston, for example, Jews were not present at the creation and never seemed to be able to win the battle for social acceptance and claim their place among the city's civic leaders. San Francisco, by contrast, had Jews from the beginning, and they have continued to play a central and respected role in many aspects of the city's life and culture. The dynamism of Baltimore society provides a totally different model, since the city experienced several new beginnings in the form of successive waves of immigration and economic development. This dynamism was apparent as early as 1826, when Solomon Edding and Jacob Cohen, both active in Baltimore business affairs, lobbied successfully for the right of Maryland's Jews to hold elective office, which they had been denied since colonial days. Despite the strength of prejudice in the legislature, the Jew Bill, as it was called, ultimately passed because it promised to attract Jewish capital and investment to Baltimore, a prospect that aligned with the goals of a rising group of legislators who represented the interest of the city against those of the rural power base. Just months after the bill's passage, Edding and Cohen were both elected to the Baltimore City Council. The humble German Jews who arrived after 1820 were greeted with greater skepticism than the earliest Jewish settlers, yet they too entered a society with a dominant culture in flux. A huge number of non-Jewish German immigrants challenged the hegemony of the old Protestant elite, incidentally making room for Jews, who, although socially aloof from non-Jews in their native lands, refashioned themselves as part of the German community on these shores. Their participation in German social clubs and their rising economic stature gave them a central role in civic life. Not that anti-Semitism and social discrimination disappeared from the Baltimore scene, as Jews who increasingly faced exclusion from neighborhoods, social clubs, and leisure resorts by the end of the 19th century knew well. Still, Baltimore's rich ethnic mix and constantly shifting economic opportunities provided recurring chances to counter these threatening forces. Thus, even as the massive influx of East European Jews between 1880 and 1924 exacerbated native-born fears and prejudices, it also made Jews the single largest immigrant group in the city by World War I, giving them newfound strength in local politics, commerce, and the trade union movement. Although hemmed into certain residential districts and social institutions well into the 20th century, Jews' comparatively greater economic mobility gave the first native-born generation a means of demonstrating that they were American and Baltimorean, in every way. They frequented Baltimore's parks and leisure spots and helped create a variety of cultural institutions, from the Hippodrome to the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra and even the Block, Baltimore's notorious red light district. They not only rooted for the Orioles, the Colts, and the Bullets, but they were instrumental in bringing these teams to the city. With gustatory institutions like Atman's and Nate's and Leon's, they fashioned a Baltimore version of the New York deli and even gave the Maryland crab cake their own twist with the invention of the coddy, which better suited Jewish dietary sensibilities. And of course, maybe you know that Old Bay was also created by a German Jewish refugee who was fired from McCormick Spices for being Jewish and went on to invent Old Bay, which only not too long ago was now repurchased by McCormick. As the barriers of social discrimination fell following World War II, Jews wove themselves into the local fabric, producing some of Baltimore's most noted cultural, philanthropic, and political leaders, from the Meyerhoffs to the Mandels. Even the decline of Baltimore as a manufacturing center in the post-war period did not sideline Jews, for whom the massive redevelopment of downtown and growth of suburbia provided fresh opportunities as business owners, real estate developers, and professionals. And so now I want to just move to the last theme, which in some ways for me is the most interesting. It echoes a lot of my previous work on Jews and race. That Jewish life in Baltimore was decisively shaped by the presence of a substantial African American community, which was the largest in any city outside the Deep South before the early 20th century. Owing once again to its location between North and South, Baltimore was the first place where a major population of Jews came into contact with a major population of blacks, and where the two groups interacted on a significant level. Servicing the mercantile needs of the African American community became a major enterprise among those with fewer resources and fewer compunctions about dealing with blacks than white Gentile traders had. Pennsylvania Avenue, the commercial thoroughfare of Black Baltimore, was populated by Jewish-owned enterprises well into the 20th century. Conflict as well as cooperation marked Black-Jewish relations. On the one hand, acculturating Jews felt the need to distance themselves from the stigma blacks represented in a Southern society. While Jews generally benefited from their status as white, the fact that they were often excluded from clubs, swimming pools, private schools, and other social institutions raised the fear, as a writer for the Baltimore Jewish Comment put it in 1906, that, quote, "the Jew will be put on a level with the Negro as an undesirable." In response, Baltimore Jews sometimes took pains to distinguish themselves as white, as U.S. Senator Isidore Rayner and Maryland Attorney General Isaac Loeb Strauss did when they helped lead the fight for black disenfranchisement in Maryland in the early 20th century. But despite such tensions, Jews found themselves inextricably linked to African Americans, both because of their economic ties and the reflection of their own past that Jews often saw in the black experience. Thus, despite the social dangers, Baltimore's Jewish garment workers were among the first in the nation to welcome blacks into their unions during a massive strike movement in the early 1920s. During Prohibition, Jews and blacks often cooperated in numbers running and bootlegging, while the civil rights movement of the post-war era involved a different sort of cooperation, punctuated by moments of conflict when Jewish businesses suffered in the 1968 riots that followed the King assassination. Jewish neighborhoods offered less resistance to blacks than other white areas, although Jews' ongoing concern for their social position generally gave way to white flight. Overall, because of the central importance of the African American community to Baltimore's life and culture, relationships with African Americans can be said to reflect the social strivings and particular identity concerns of Jews to a degree unusual in other American cities. And so, while numerous books and articles had been written about Baltimore Jews over the years, before On Middle Ground came out, there was no full-scale scholarly study that had been undertaken that might offer a comprehensive analysis of Baltimore's special role in the way that I've been outlining for you tonight. And that was kind of the goal that we had when we set about this project. So I'm extremely gratified that we were able to kind of get at something about what really makes Baltimore different, what created a Jewish life here that in some ways was similar to other American Jewish communities, but it also had its own distinctive feel. It reflected both the opportunities and the pressures of the region in which it was located. And I'm very happy that some of those ideas have now been carried on by this wonderful new exhibition that you'll have a chance to see. So I'll send you off with that framework, and hopefully it'll help you understand better some of the things that you'll see in the exhibit. Thank you, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you.